Hello guys, hello Steven. My name is Lars Stender. I'm a writer from Denmark. I'm specializing in science fiction fantasy stories. And today we'll be reading from my book, Mandigo and the Hellhounds, which is a fantasy story. And it's about this young boy, Mandigo, who happens to be an apprentice of a wizard. But he doesn't know that yet. He's about to learn, and his world will be turned upside down. So, without further ado, I'll be starting from on the book, and I'll be starting with the prologue. And here we go. Mandigo and the Hellhounds, prologue. The baby lay screaming at the top of his voice between the rushes by the river bank. Mandigo stared down at the infant and did not know what to say. What in the world was this about, he thought. It was screaming like crazy. It had to be a girl, he thought, as he unconsciously wrinkled his 8-year-old nose. He hated girls. They were always teasing and laughing at him just because he's a tamad and got into trouble all the time. Mandigo straightened up and looked around. What should he do? He'd been on his way into the forest carrying a small bag of flour for the old wise woman Greta when he had suddenly heard the sound of the baby crying. By following the noise, he had made his way to the child. It lay in a rocking cradle of intertwined branches, twigs, leaves, and grass, and was wrapped in some blankets and other, and the beautiful pelt of a grey mountain cat. Mandigo knew that grey mountain cats did not live near his village, and that only the local squire, Baron Nicholas, could afford to own such an expensive fur. But Baron Nicholas was old and bent with age, and his furs were worn and torn. This mountain cat skin he saw before him, aside from being slightly dirty, looked new and to be of very fine quality. The cradle with the baby was too far out amid the rushes for Mandigo to be able to reach it from the shore. He looked around for a branch that could perhaps use to grab hold of the cradle, but could not see anything that was suitable. Darn! There was nothing left for him to do but go out in the cold water and pull the baby in. Sighing with annoyance, he put the bag of flour down and took off his clogs and whole socks. What a pain. It was early spring and the air was mild. The water in the river, on the other hand, was still very cold. Mandigo cursed as he carefully stepped into the river. He gasped loudly when the icy, wet sensation from the river wall spread up his legs and his teeth began to chatter. I must be crazy, he hissed as he gnashed his teeth. He hated babies. They were always screaming and they smelt awful. Nevertheless, he was now standing up to both knees in cold, muddy water in order to save one. Suddenly, he stepped into a hole and was just about to lose his balance when he managed to grab hold of a handful of rushes. However, at this point he was really beginning to get quite cold. His shirt was soaking up with water as it was a sponge. Boy, would his parents be angry when they see him in his wet clothes. And he was certain to get a flogging from his father. His father was a village miller, and he was a harsh and impatient man who often gave Mandigo a flogging if he thought he was too slow or too clumsy, which he was all the time. Mandigo could not help shuddering at the thought of what awaited him at home. The worst of it was that no matter what he did now, it would with certainty give him problems. If he took the baby home with him and left the flour, he would most likely get yelled at because he hadn't delivered the flour to Greta, baby or no baby. And if he delivered the flour first and then carried the baby home to the village afterwards, he'd get scolded for having been away so long. There was a lot of work to do at the mill, and Mandigo's father had given him strict orders to return as quickly as possible. And if there was anything dilly-dallying on Mandigo's part, he'd be sure to get a flogging. Again. Mandigo had now almost reached the cradle. He stretched out his left hand and grabbed hold of it. At that very moment, the baby began to cry again. With two big blue eyes, it stared up at Mandigo, who completely froze. It was like looking into the eyes of a much older person, and for a brief moment he felt dizzy. But then the baby smiled at him, and suddenly he felt shy. He grabbed hold of the baby and carefully lifted it up into his arms. Watching his step, he slowly began to turn around and tottered back to the river bank. It was ice cold, wet, and difficult, but thanks to the work he had been doing in his father's mill, Mandigo was strong for his age. He managed to reach the shore safely and sat for a short while to catch his breath. The baby was still very calm and as a comment regarded Mandigo with those unique and precocious eyes. But what now? Mandigo wasn't sure whether he could manage to carry both the baby and the bag of flour, and in what direction should he go anyway. The baby started to cry again. Mandigo sighed as he put his socks and shoes back on. "Keep quiet, you little brat," he grumbled and scowled at the child, which only made it cry even louder. Angry and frustrated, Mandigo lifted the baby up, whereupon it immediately calmed down. "It's probably hungry," Mandigo thought, and heard the grumbling of his own stomach at the idea of the food. He had had a little something to eat at home, but the walk through the woods and into the lake had taken a lot of energy, and he was beginning to freeze in his wet clothes. He looked down at the bag with flour. No, it would be impossible for him to carry both that and the baby. He would have to let the bag stay here while he carried the baby. But where to? Home to the village or out to Gretas? Home to the village, of course. The women at home would know what to do with the child. Maybe they'd be able to figure out where it came from. Strengthened by his decision, Mandigo started to walk back along the river towards the ford with the baby in his arms. He reached the ford shortly and was about to turn to the right at the path, which would lead him back to the village, when, at the very moment, a huge stag stepped onto the path and stood in his way. Mandigo jumped and nearly dropped the baby out of sheer surprise. He looked up at that big animal with his mouth agape. Never in his life had he seen such a huge stag. He had sometimes seen him walk in a clearing in the forest or at the ridge east of the village, and once in a while Baron Nicholas' hunters had been so kind as to shoot one of them, as an expression of gratitude to the village, men who had been acting as beaters on one of the Baron's hunts. Then there would be a party, but it had been quite a while since the arthritic Baron had held such a hunt. The stag turned its head slowly and stared right back at Mandigo with its big brown eyes that exuded intelligence. From its impressive antlers, pieces of a twig dangled like tall sails on the mast of a ship taken by surprise in a storm. Mandigo was completely petrified. He hardly dared breathe. He had no idea what to do. The stag was blocking the whole path and did not seem to have any intention of moving. It suddenly dropped its head and snorted at Mandigo. Mandigo swallowed hard and started to back away. The stag remained standing with his head lowered until Mandigo had reached the ford. Then it turned slowly around and took a step towards him. Mandigo hesitated for a moment at the ford, but realized that there was no other option for him than to cross the river. He turned his back to the great stag and was just about to step into the ford when he remembered that wearing his clogs as he crossed the ford would probably not be such a good idea. On the other hand, he didn't want to put the baby down for fear that the stag might actually attack it. So instead, he made a quick decision and kicked off his clogs, leaving them on the shore before stepping into the water. It reached right above his calves, and his socks got soaked, but there was nothing to do about it. The most important thing was that he got over to the other side safely with the baby. Mandigo looked over his shoulder every now and then to see whether the stag was following them. It was, but very slowly. By the time it reached the ford, Mandigo and the baby were safely all on the other side. For a moment, Mandigo and the stag looked at one another across the river. Then the stag snorted once again and stepped into the ford. Mandigo shrieked and hurried further on down the path that led to the woods. His arms were getting somewhat tired from carrying the baby, but he didn't dare stop and rest. He couldn't understand why the stag was behaving the way it did. But he knew there was only one place for him to go now. He had to get to the Greta's cabin. Mandigo followed the path into the woods, constantly conscious of whether the stag was following or not. However, the stag seemed to move at the same pace as Mandigo, so it never gained or got closer or lagged. It just got him to walk ahead of it, as though ensuring that he'd make it out to Gretas. Mandigo's heart was hammering away and his mouth was dry from sheer fear. But at the same time he was also confused. Why hadn't the stag attacked him? Why was it holding back? Was it just playing with him? Mandigo suddenly discovered that he and the stag were no longer alone. Some mice and a couple of rabbits had emerged from the thicket on both sides of the path and were following Mandigo and the baby. Every once in a while, one or two of them would stop and get up on their hind legs as though to be able to see with the two children better. A flickering of wings in the air made Mandigo look up. To his great surprise, he saw a flock of thrushes and sparrows gathered in the branches right above him and the baby, and he followed them by flying and hopping from tree to tree and from branch to branch. There started out being about 20, but little by little as Mandigo walked, the numbers grew. A movement on the right side turned out to be a red squirrel that jumped on the top of an old tree stump at the edge of the path, from which it now sat and stared intensely at Mandigo and the baby, while it twitched his nose. There were soon more squirrels, as well as rabbits and hares and even foxes. But the foxes made no attempt to chase the other animals. Just like the other animals, they followed Mandigo and the baby. It was soon swarming with animals in the undergrowth and in the trees surrounding Mandigo and the baby. Gulls, stoats, minks, otters, does, hawks, falcons, grass snakes, lizards, roes, bees, rats, more stags, goldcrests, willow warblers, and suddenly a great eagle, whose powerful flapping made the air around Mandigo whiz like an autumn storm. But Mandigo was so tired by now that his arms, which were carrying the baby, nearly hung all the way down to his knees, and they were shaking under him. He couldn't carry a baby one step further, and so with a faint-hearted whimpering, he sank to the ground, where he tried to cover the baby with his body. He was convinced that all the animals would pounce him in any second. But he just stopped and stood in a circle around him at a distance of a few feet. Mandigo looked around at all the animals and couldn't believe what he saw. He took a deep breath, and attempted to find a way to escape. But he was cold, wet, tired. His feet were sore and his socks torn. Suddenly, a quiver went through the crowd of animals, dividing them, so that an opening emerged in the circle. An enormous wolf suddenly appeared from the opening. It was so big that it could look Mandigo straight in the eyes even when he was standing. Its fur shimmered in grey and dark browns that glimmered in gold. One side of the head was almost completely black, while the other was white, with a black ring around his eye. The eye in the black side of his head shone just as strongly and brightly as a star in the night sky, and when it looked Mandigo, it felt as though it was looking directly into the deepest part of his soul. But that was nothing compared to the shock he was about to get in the next moment. "I am Magdan, king of the forest," Mandigo heard a voice in his head say, which left him completely stupefied. The wolf spoke to him without moving its lips and without a sound coming from its body. It just stared at him with his strange reddish golden eyes, and his voice reached him as though it were through magic. Its voice was soft and rumbling. It sounded like a far-away, distant thunder on a really warm and muggy evening in the late summer. A shiver went down Mandigo's spine. "Your name is Mandigo, is it not?" the wolf asked. Yes," Mandigo responded hesitantly. It was like a dream. He just wasn't sure whether the dream was about to turn into a nightmare. "Do you know who that is that you're holding in your arms?" Mandigo slowly shook his head from side to side. The wolf answered with this poem. "She is light where there is darkness. She is rain when there is drought. She is a gift when there is a need. And when the dark one comes, you must protect her name. She is a brooch on your cape. She makes the children clap. She brings ships safely into harbor. And when the dark one comes, you must protect her name. She is a warrior, but gentle. She encourages diligence in you. You will one day be useful to her. And when the dark one comes, you will protect her name." Mandigo blinked, and all the animals disappeared. End of prologue.
That was amazing, huh guys? that was the end of the prologue, and the next one is gonna be the chapter 1. For now, have an amazing evening, and I'll see you later.